and we are live. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Chocobo Radio episode number 8. Today, we have a very, very special show, one that I've been waiting for probably all week, because we have two of the best lore creators on the internet. First, we have friend of the pod, Synodic Scribe. How are you doing today, Mr. Scribe?
I'm doing great, man. It's glad to be back.
Yeah,
I had so much fun the last time I was here.
Yeah, well, that's what I try to do. I try to have a fun and entertaining show. And then we also have the Yorzian Archive himself, Elio. How do you like to go? How do you like to be called?
Elio Forceron. I mean, that's what we go with.
Awesome. Well, we have a very great show today. We are going to be talking all about patch 6.4. But before we get into any of the details, I just want to start off by asking, what did you guys think of 6.4? And did it live up to your expectations of the patch?
Yeah. I mean, I will say for me, 6.4 absolutely positive. I guess in brief, positive, lived up to my expectations. I think in general, this patch cycle has been a lot of steps towards a climax rather than having the epilogue 0.1 to 0.3 and then prologue to expansion 0.4, 0.5 going on. So this has felt different. So that's felt a little weird, but that's kind of just a byproduct of doing it different.
Right. I can see what you mean by that. What about you, Scribe? How did you take 6.4?
The one thing that happened in 6.4 that I was really happy about was that Ceramus was not some shadow mastermind behind everything. Like everyone was thinking, did they include Ceramus? Of course they did. This is the Final Fantasy IV expansion. But instead of making him the super mega big brain, he's just like a big bad. And Gobz gets to stand on his own 2 feet as a villain. I love that.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I kept reading and hearing on lore, theory crafting videos was that Zero was going to become Zeramus in some way. Was it a letdown that didn't happen? Were you happy?
I didn't see that coming at all. No.
Well, I was hopeful that wasn't going to be the case. So for me, the fact that it wasn't has been a wild, victory, for lack of a better way of putting it, in my opinion, because it was such the easy bait. And then the thing is that I'm with Scribe on this one, where having it be because in 4 it's like an incarnation of hate, basically, like Zemus is hate, right? So just having it kind of still be like a mindless creature, and then having Gobz being the presiding still force around it, I think was huge. I totally agree.
That's
see that.
One of the best things about Final Fantasy XIV as a whole. It takes inspiration from previous Final Fantasy titles, but they always try to spin it in a way that not only makes sense in the Final Fantasy XIV universe, but in a way that isn't one-to-one with the previous games, and I've always respected them for that.
And the recontextualization is what they do so wildly successfully. I mean, Crystal Tower, I think, is the most preeminent example of its recontextualization of 3, but there's many throughout. And I think maybe now the second biggest example now is becoming the recontextualization with Gobz, the Fiends, and taking that central conceit, but how do you make it make sense in this world under this context?
I see. Okay. So, it wouldn't be a spoiler cast if we didn't, actually go point by point throughout the story of 6.4. So I think that is really where I want to start off with. And we start off the patch with Cryo. So I think the question that's on everybody's mind right now is, what was up with that letter? Scribe, tell us what's going on with this letter. Yeah.
I'm going to be completely blunt with you. At the moment, there is nothing going on with that letter.
Okay.
Now, of course, there is some theory crafting saying, oh, it came from Mericidia. Oh, it came from the New World, or all this other stuff. Because I think one of my subscribers said, oh, the symbols on the side of that letter are distinct to a tribe from this culture, and that could be tied to Mericidia. And I'm like, okay, that's a cool idea, but that's that's big theory crafting. At the moment, we have no confirmed proof it is much of anything. But I am, of course, curious to... I'll bite. I'm curious to see what it says later down the line, but I'm not going to be like, oh, this is going to be the biggest thing ever. Because we don't know.
Yeah, and I think this is one of my, I wouldn't say issues, but I find myself constantly when I'm going through either the MSQ or just like any of the quest lines is I keep coming back to this idea of, is this a unexplained plot line, or is this something that I am missing? So I think one of the biggest questions that I have for you two as lore creators is, as you're going through like the MSQ, do you ever find yourself asking yourself that question, which is, am I missing something, or is this something that has yet to be explained?
Yeah. Do you mind if I go first real quick on that one?
Go for it, man.
Sorry, I'm not sure what the best rotation conversation is. But no, I think the thing is that there's a really important delineation between something that has not been explained yet and is being seeded versus something that just goes wholly unexplained or doesn't make contextual sense whatsoever. Because there are times when you can seed something. For instance, there are aspects of Omega's quest line in Stormblood that seed things that are only more relevant in Endwalker. And so I find personally that just because something doesn't answer everything right away doesn't mean it's failing. Doesn't mean that it's I feel like I'm missing something. And most of the time, it feels like because of my knowledge of other things and other lore and other pieces of information in the story, I can make either conjecture or contextual guesses about what's likely.
Interesting. Yeah. How do you see it, Scribe?
Honestly, this will be a bit of a bias rant, but when it comes to Final Fantasy XIV's writing, it's less of a did I miss something more of a, well, they went without explaining something again. The Final Fantasy XIV has the problem of it throws like he said, seeds around everywhere, and they kind of just choose where they want to go at random. Like one of the most popular ones up to today was, of course, the Heart of Sabik, and everything involving that.
I thought you were bring up the Echo.
Exactly, and there are other things throughout the expansions that we've never returned to, and I don't see us ever going back to. So whenever I see stuff like that, I'm just like, okay, well, I'll give them the chance to elaborate on these things, but I'm not exactly crossing my fingers, if you know what I mean.
I see.
I mean, because we're in Endwalker, and they still haven't unclouded Ilsabard.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll get to that at 7.0.
Yeah, no, I mean, would make a lot of sense for there at least like a Corvosi map would make sense based on setups both in Endwalker but also throughout. I mean, even if it's not a Mercedes expansion, especially if it was one, like a map going to Corvos would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I can see that. Okay, so we talk to Cryo, we get some permission to get Ether from the Isle of Ham, and we get a new dungeon. I personally loved the dungeon. I thought the dungeon was visually stunning, which I feel like we're starting to get into this point with Final Fantasy XIV where you can tell that they are upping the production quality of pretty much everything, even the cutscenes that we've seen.
Food, like the 6.3 food.
Yeah, the food, everything. Yeah. So I'm really excited about that. But just in general for the Ether font, what did y'all think?
Loved it.
Yeah.
Honestly, I liked it because it gets to show essentially the players what happens to creatures in an aether-rich environment. Of course, if you read the lore, you already knew that's kind of what happened, but players who don't read that stuff, now they get to see, oh, this is what happens to animals in a super aether-rich environment.
Right. Yeah.
And it's great too because you get this combination of both seeing Charlian architecture, but also it kind of feels even still slightly different, and it reminds you of Vol, but then Vol's also become Eureka, so it's its own weirdness. And so it's this great thing where all the islands now still feel of a kin to each other, but also still feel like they almost have a distinct identity.
I can see that. Yeah. So we go through this dungeon, and at the end of it, we gather a bunch of ether to take to Garlemald. One of the things that I kept reading on Reddit, of all places, was people did not like the Garlemald story plot. What do you all think?
To be brutally honest, I'm frustrated, mostly because I feel like sometimes that comes from a place of just not liking any of the politicking in 14. And then other times I feel like it's because like a frustration of people who are currently under occupation. I mean, a form of health towards Reconstruction occupation, but occupation, like contending with the reality of that. Like, I don't want a story where they're just, all the Garleans are like, yes, you know that nuanced, complicated thing we were going through in Endwalker? We're just gonna, everything's fine, everyone's okay with this, there's no problem. And so that's why I've really loved, like, the ending role quest and, you know, the continuation of this. And to be fair, even this story is trying to wrap it up still pretty quick, right? Like, you haven't been, like, the most holdout of people are trying to, like, okay, they're relatively conceding and on our side. So it's like, I feel like it's trying to balance not miring itself in that, like, struggle, but it's also paying acknowledgement to, like, it's not like people are just like, everything is fine. And it really reminds me of, you know, the confluence of opinions and struggles in, like, Japan during the 50s, which is relevant post-World War II.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And well, one of the things that people kept coming back to was this idea of Hildebranding the MSQ, or just specifically that one cutscene. I know this might be a hot take, but I love Hildebrand. I think Hildebrand got really, really great in Endwalker. I think ARR and Heaven's Word, but I think Hildebrand was great. But what did you like? What was your reaction when you got to that scene? And you know, the like, they were. I think it was the Warrior of Light, Estinian, and Ishtola, if I remember correctly. What was your reaction when you got to that Hildebranding of the MSQ?
I honestly don't. Hildebranding of Ishtola.
Hildebranding of the MSQ. Elaborate.
So there was one specific cutscene where the Warrior of Light and Estinian, and I think it was Ishtola, they were, you know, looking at each other, and there was like, it was just specifically the sound effects that they use where, you know, like,
are you talking about the Loperates? When they
yeah.
Oh, that was with like Zero and Urianger.
Yeah, it was your, yeah. My apologies.
Literally, most of the people I know, like, knew that was going to be a joke from the moment they saw the trailer. Like, that sort of comedic bit, like, slight decrease of tension through a moment like that has existed all throughout Final Fantasy XIV. And, I mean, especially in patch, like, you have 6.1 with the Y'shtola, if you say the line about, you know, you can, sometimes those moments are elicited by choices, but those have always been present. So I think to say that is... you kind of have to ignore prior examples. Like, if you don't like that ever at all, fair enough, but...
Honestly, my favorite moment in of those moments in 14 so far is back in ARR when the Admiral had that armor competition. Just pulls out a gun. It was like, okay, time to up the ante. Bam! Yep.
Okay, wait, going off that, too, you have the Goldsmith, right, with the Rocket Lalafell.
So like it had repelled headbutt. Yeah. So,
hey, Shiloh.
Heyo.
Yeah. I apologize. I mixed the times.
No. Sorry. But yeah, I think this is probably more damning than I really mean it to sound, but I think a lot of times when people have a criticism of a current piece of content, I think if you look back, you almost always see those, like, and sometimes it's different to, like, if you're criticizing a specific type of thing or something, but to say that sort of thing is somehow new to this patch cycle or something, I think just ignores the sense of humor this game has always had.
Yeah, no, I think you're right with that take. So going back to the MSQ, you know, we go through Garlemald, and there is a lot of talk about trust and about friendship. Were you guys catching on with what was being foreshadowed, or how were you going through it? What was on your mind when you were going through it?
Grab, do you want to go first?
Sure,
I want to go first.
That entire thing with Zero, as like we've been seeing this with almost every patch that she's been involved in. With every patch, she's been essentially relearning something that she either forgot or ignored as a voice. And so in this time, it was trust. And this was the moment that kind of trust led into all the other things that she remembered. And now that she has this knowledge again, she's essentially regained some of her lost humanity. And I feel like that's the entire point of the emphasis on trust. Not only did she get her trust back, she got her humanity back.
Yeah, emphatically, I agree on that. And the thing I think is you need to do that. I think you need to do that story because otherwise you cheapen what it means to live on the 13th, right? If you want to make Zero a scion in 7.0 or whatever, you have to tell a story of what it means to recover from her perspective, many, many years at this point. Of
more than several thousand at this point.
Well, it depends because when she comes out of the rift, seems semi-immediate, right? Like based on her, like she misses the flood of darkness, but then is around for the rest of it. It seems like the case. Did you ever get an explicit timeline on that?
We don't, which is really confusing. But we do know that the Void has been around for several thousand years. So.
At least 10,000, right? Doesn't Gobz say 10 millennia? Something or something.
Too much time for anyone.
that is the thing, right? But so with I think the most interesting question about Zero's position has up to this point been, there's been no reason to think, oh, she'll turn evil based on the thing. But all the lessons that you see her learn throughout 6.x, there's a meaningful way in which you could apply what she's learning from that to her having cause to join Gobz. If Gobz's plan did not necessitate the destruction of the source, her lesson that it's not worth damning another world for the sake of one's own, if the source has potential to help and is choosing not to, she might join him. If she's learning to trust, maybe she learns to trust him. Maybe, but so like there's not, I never was like, oh, she's gonna betray us. It was never on that camp. What I loved, there was enough ambiguity of like, oh, this is not just she's learning to be a staunch ally for us, no question. It's about her regaining humanity, but what that and her desire to save her own home. And what that means it was compelling to me, at least.
Because if you think about it, like if the Zero that we first meet was the Zero that Gobz made the offer to, so long as he offered enough ether, she would have said yes.
Yeah, totally.
A world of Aether, a bounty of Aether, like
exactly. She would have said yes unconditionally because, like, okay, can't say no to that prize. But now she's remembered there's more to life than what I have to gain.
Yeah,
I see. In this, point of the story, there was a part that I was a little bit confused about. So there was a flashback or a shot of Xenos out in the world when they were having this conversation about friends. Why did they do that? Why bring up Xenos at this part of the story?
Because he's the juxtaposition for both Euless and for Zero in that moment. You think about her relationship to Xenos and also how, like, when she first starts talking to us, the way in which she can't conceptualize why he called us friend or what friend means, or her understanding of our world is rooted through him. And then from Euless' standpoint, that conversation in the snow and his utter apathy towards what Garlemald meant, what home meant, what like trust and all that meant. So to me, it's because Xenos is such a lynch point for dealing with both those characters who are the crutch of that moment. Or the crutch of that moment.
That Zero was finally having the revelation of, wow, he really was a crazy bastard.
Yeah, literally, straight up.
Wow. Yeah. So, stuff is going on in Garlemald. They don't really like us being there, but eventually it turns out not to be a big deal. And, there's a trust being formed with Vershawn and people in Garlemald. There's a trade that comes up, and, the Tower of Babel happens. Yeah.
It's so funny that it takes a dragon telling them to shut up and grow up.
But I love it because it's not even just that. It takes a void sense to remind the dragon that sometimes you need to be pragmatic in terms of making it mutual success, not just rooting it in like trust or friendship, right? Like they're both, reminding them of a lesson there.
Yeah. Yeah. So we get to the Tower of Babel, we shoot ether to the moon, and when you get to the moon, Ishtola, she drops a pretty big lore bomb, in my opinion, where she talks about why portals were so easy to make on the 13th. Can either of you, just sum up that whole, conversation? Because I gotta be honest, when I was sitting there doing it, it kind of just went over my head.
Astrology breaks the barrier. But astrality, the sources, reflections are drawn to the source, and astrality also helps break down those barriers.
Yeah. When Heidelin's Thunder Yeah, when Heideling's under the world, her essentially, let's call it a spell, essentially made it so that all the shards would stay in their own little bubble, because she knew that they would naturally want to pull back toward the source. But of course, like, all the shards still under that spell, but the 13th was so twisted and corrupted by darkness that now it's naturally starting to draw toward the source anyways. So now you've got her spell keeping it in place with the astral energy trying to go anyway. And that's why little portals have been opening up for so long.
Yeah. And that's, to be fair, the lore, that moment is more of a confirmation of something that if you had known the lore, like if you pay attention to the lore prior, some of us had like hazarded a guess like something like that might be up, because you know, for instance, that there's the pull of the reflections to the source is explained explicitly as early as 5.0 and implicitly as early as like 3.x. So the pull thing we always knew. The question was what made the 13th special, and you could kind of assume it was the astrality. Now, how that also manifests, it seems that astrology not only helps though it's to break into the source, but because of the role quests in 5.0, we know that there can be void portals into the first, which means the barrier between reflections in theory could be broken down by that astrality as well. So something like Zeromus may not only be able to create tears into the source, but into other reflections.
Oh.
Essentially, that unchecked darkness is just reaching out to anything familiar. It just so happens to be mostly the source.
It seems like the walls of that bars them or something.
Exactly. Honestly, we would have to have like the finer details of what exactly Heideling did to truly understand it, and that's information we're likely never gonna get.
And that's the problem with 14 too, because, you know, like going off of your initial question when we started earlier, right? It's the level to which that, like, leaving certain things a little bit open-ended for, like, speculation or hypotheses or is a strength or a weakness is also sometimes personal, because sometimes, like, the ability to, like have contention and try to question and try to figure that out can be really fun, but for some people it can just be frustrating.
Very frustrating sometimes.
Yeah, because I mean, like, I'm not the biggest lore guy. I think I can admit that to myself. But I do find the lore interesting, and that's why I love being able to, you know, put on a lore recap video on a drive, especially when they're like, you know, 20-30 minutes long. It's perfect. It's perfect for a long drive, and that's what that's usually how I spend my time when I'm just driving from place to place at work. So we get to the Red Moon, and you know, we don't really see anything when we get there, but eventually we do come across Azaya, and I wanted to ask you both, what did you think of her reasoning for, you know, wanting to stay in this bubble that Gobz has created? Was it a good storytelling way to explain her, you know, her whole story, or was it more of a, I don't know, so maybe you didn't like it. How did you see it, Elio?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, like, to me, it worked completely fine, because it's like, yeah, that's basically, it's just, instead of an exceptional, crazy, or weird reason, there's just a really rational one. Hey, the darkness would affect me. I have no way home, and this is the best I could do in the given circumstance, and then have dealt with that for 5,000 years. And just for me, it's like, that seems pretty reasonable. And so, maybe, I don't know. I guess I hadn't thought to question it much in terms of it being anything but, yeah, a very pragmatic and reasonable answer.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, it's like I said in one of my videos, she was in a lose-lose situation. There was no way she was going to come out, like, positive. She was either going to turn into a void tent and go completely crazy, or accept Gobz's deal and maybe remain pure. So she just chose the latter option. I mean, and I can't entirely blame her.
I mean, yeah, it's like she's buying time because that's the only good option.
Oh yeah, I mean, the first brood dragons are eternal so long as they aren't depleted of their ether, so I mean, she could just bide her time indefinitely if she really wanted to.
So we meet Gobz, and I think one of the questions that even I had, and one of the things that I think Ishtola brought up on the last patch, was why did Gobz wait so long? I think she said 5,000 years to I don't know, consume or to use as Daya? I think we got an answer to that. So can you explain that? Why did Gobz wait so long to go with his plan? Take it away, Scribe.
Essentially, the defeat of Zodiark on the Source was the crux of everything. Like, the fact that he was defeated on the Source meant that all of his sundered, counterparts were also discorporated. Now, it was confirmed essentially in this patch, but it was alluded to previously, that when that happened, all the other shard Zodiarks, essentially, they're either discorporated and just rejoined the ethereal realm of that respective shard. But since the 13th no longer has an ethereal realm, what is all that sacrificial ancient soul stuff gonna do if not be corrupted by the void? So that essentially was what made Gobz go, yeah, this is what I'm going to do to, as he puts it, shatter the wheel.
Yeah. And actually, can you explain that? Because I know he referenced that a lot, especially in the trial. I think that was one of the voice lines that he kept bringing up this wheel. What is this wheel that he's talking about?
The fact that they can't die. The infinite, the recursion of them. If a void scent dies, it either is recorporated or eaten, and there's just no end.
Oh, so like a cycle. Yeah.
The 13th is this endless purgatory in like a traditional sense, in like a not good sense, where there's just suffering and fear and nightmare, and the strong eat the weak until the strong are defeated. Like it's hell, basically. And so the only way to end that would be to give them access to an ethereal sea, in his mind. So the source is the only mechanism by which he can free them from this purgatory.
Which is where a lot of confusion comes from, honestly. Because, and Elio can even back me up on this one, it was asserted in earlier, expansions, all the way back in the RR even, that the source, the ethereal realm on the source rejects the energy of the void. One of the NPCs even says that. He says, the ethereal sea won't take the stuff. And so it was more of a thing of, the void scent dies on the source, goes back to the void, and then they come back. That's how the fight between the source and the demons, as they put it, never ended.
Now, the guild leave that you're talking about is interesting because it is really weird in how it talks about it. But the thing is that we don't see other void scent leave behind those fire pyres it does. And so it's hard to tell if that guild leave or that guild test that you do is a weird outcome, if it's specific to those void scent, the aether that they're leaving behind is specifically astrally charged, but their souls would still rejoin the ethereal sea. Or, when you nullstone something with Diablos, there's no impression that he's unable to rejoin the ethereal sea. So it's hard to be sure what some of the very earliest lore points they were making around that and how much it's supposed to be either specific examples, byproducts of people who don't necessarily know better. I mean, for the longest time, people didn't understand the nature of the void being the 13th, let alone...
No, exactly. The problem is that we've had so many interactions with void and void scent up until now, and then only now they decide to, talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that they refrained from basically talking about the rules sense. It's also so weird because that guild has such a weird thing on a number of levels because and the gargoyle are just, oh god, it's a whole thing.
But no, yeah. So there's that entire thing with the void, but it's fine ultimately at the end.
I would say in defense of it, everything about it functionally works within the metaphysics as long as you don't necessarily assume that pre-established point is the case. Because we know the ethereal seas are separate, because we know, for instance, from Endwalker that specifically Heidelin had to pull Emmett and Minfilia's soul to the source.
Oh, speaking of which, before we go any further, have y'all finished Pandemonium?
Yes.
Then you know that there's an entire point I would like to make.
Yes, I feel like I'm with you on that one. That's a bullshit.
Y'all going gay, bro.
It's a soul there. It like that. Okay, on a number. I'm usually the last.
So
person
much
to
wrong with the
possibly-
pandemonium ray.
I'm the last person to ever be like, I'm usually like, okay, you know what? It's not perfect. Maybe there's a hypothesis this could work. But I'm like, okay, you're going to have to figure out something because there's no reason that Elidibus' soul should be on the source.
Right.
Whatsoever.
Yeah, I was gonna ask for the listeners, what are you talking about?
Okay, so essentially, remember back in Base Endwalker when we go to essentially the Crystal Tower and meet up with Elidibus' soul, which we knew was contained in the Crystal Tower after the Seed of Sacrifice fight.
Mm-hmm.
So we go talk to him, and then of course Deus Ex MacGuffin, he suddenly knows that, oh, I need to send you back to Elpis, and stuff like that. So, here's the thing. This is where the problem starts.
Okay.
He's already in the Crystal Tower. His soul is trapped there because of the spell. Number 2, it is implied that he consumed all of himself, even his entire soul, to create the power and guidance necessary to send you back to the past. What Pandemonium states is that not only did his soul not be consumed, but somehow it also, number 1, got out of the Crystal Tower, did not rejoin the ethereal sea of the first, but got all the way back to the Source's ethereal realm. How?
Yeah, it's the most bullshit possible answer I can come up with is, okay, he's expended his Aether to create the gate, and in creating the gate, actually allowed him to access the tear in between the first and the source in the ocular in order to be able to bring his soul back into the source, which is bullshit and absolutely is not how that works, so don't use that for any thing whatsoever.
Nothing short of them actually admitting like what happened would please me at this point.
Yeah.
Because that entire sequence should not have happened with the established lore.
Yeah. I will say the one thing that we do get in that moment, though, is also that's the first time we get confirmation that in 6.0 during that scene is that he can no longer sense Lord Zodiark, means that on the first, which is the first time that we know with killing him on the source freed his essence in the other, in at least one other reflection.
Sorry to give you that pandemonium tangent, but the lore nerds needed to rant for a second.
Feel free.
Yeah.
Oh, go for it, bro.
Yeah, I'll bring it up to Stout next week and see what he says.
He'll say the same thing. That's one where no matter where you come on, like the line of like forgiveness versus non-forgiveness, you're gonna be pretty sus on that. If you're like or heavy into lore, like wait a second. Oh.
So one of the questions that we had before 6.4 was what happened to the Watcher on this moon? Did we get an answer to that?
We don't know when Heidelin created the Watcher in the Loporrits, because Yosella even comments while you're on the moon, if you go talk to her while you're investigating the moon, she's like, there's no evidence that the Watcher and Loporrits were here. So either 1, she created them before the Sundering, and the Void, the Wave of Darkness, just destroyed them and everything. Or 2, she had not created them yet.
Yeah. To wind it back a little, we know that the Watcher is the remnant of Vanna's convocation of 13. He's the one not of the 12. The 12 become the 12, that whole thing. But the Watcher is part of giving himself over to Vanna in his totality. And so the Watcher is basically like the Amratine mirages that we see in The Tempest. The Watcher's like that. It makes sense that she only made the Loporrits for the Source, because the Source was the only one that was ever going to be part of the Exodus, right? We knew the Reflections were screwed. If the Medion plan doesn't go to plan, that the Loporrits were there just to make sure that the moon could become an arc for the Source. So them being on the other Reflections doesn't really make sense, but the Watcher is there to make sure that the stabilizers for the confining of Zodiark stay. Everything's going to plan with that. We know from that Gobz flashback in 6.2, 6.3 that he slew the Watcher of the 13th Mare Lamentorum. So that's, I think, what the ultimate fate of him would have been.
No, yeah. It's funny because, like, how best to explain this? But I guess if you just want to say, everything really does just go back to the Source, because Heidelin even confessed that if something happened to the shards, like the source will be fine. But if the source were destroyed and like corrupted beyond recognition, every shard would suffer the same fate eventually, because that's just how the spell works. So it like Elio said, so she eventually probably would have just cut corners and said, yeah, sorry, screw the shards. The source is the only one of real value here.
But she basically says that. She doesn't imply it's the only one of value, but that like it seems that there was no version of the plan that was not just about minimizing damage, right?
No, you're right.
Yeah. It's like, but that's the Charlene thing. That's why it's the Charlene, the plan the Charlene's going with is from their perspective, it's there isn't another solution. All we can do is minimize the fallout of the final days. And our perspective is no, we can stop this.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. As I was going through the patch, I kept coming back to this question where I was asking myself, and maybe I missed this, so I was hoping one of you could clarify. But what exactly happened to all the crystals, the memoria that Zero created when she, fought? Well, when she slayed the archfiends, like did I miss something there? Like, what happened to those crystals, and what were they used for? Like in the story?
There's somewhere.
Yeah, there's some.
There's somewhere.
I mean,
I couldn't quite tell you.
Yeah, I guess honestly, in looking at those, I would actually weirdly enough look ahead at the crystal of Golbez's friend, the memoria crystal for that. We're told at the beginning of 6.2 that memoria crystals, like once that seal happens, you're done. It's good and you're done for. I would suspect that there's going to come a point we're going to figure out that might have been true for the time during like the Contra Memoria, but under the there was a time where crossing reflections wasn't a thing either. It may be that we discover a methodology by which you can undo that. And maybe we do, and there's something to do it with old, the old Archfiend crystals are either liberated to be healed or something, or maybe Gobz figures out how to liberate them, and then you've got like a 4 Archfiend battle as like one of the dungeons or trials or something in 7.0, or who knows what.
No, I mean, you're not wrong, because like every spell we've seen in Final Fantasy XIV, like every spell or ability can be undone, as we proved with the Zodiarch. Even his sealing in the moon, and even the massive spell that Hydaelyn used to sunder the world from the shards and everything, that could be undone under the right circumstances. So to say that, once the Memoria Crystal is made, it's over, I'd have a hard time believing that.
Right. And that's the really important thing, is that 14 has always played with not just unreliable narrators, but narrators who are reliable but don't have the full picture. And so, like, that's a really important thing to remember, that just because one character says something doesn't mean it is actually fundamentally the truth. And sometimes you could be uncharitable and be like, oh, that's because they're retconning it. More often than not, there are, like, cases where they've demonstrated very clearly that they were thinking ahead, but having a character with a much more finite amount of knowledge state an opinion. I think an easy example would be the way in which primals are very clearly established to be more than you think they are post 2.0. And even alluded to that in 2.0 and 1.0 lore, but in the way they're presented by Minfilia and the Scions during 2.0 is that no, they are just this thing, it's like very clearly they are just, and then you get, they're just the gods of these tribes summoned with crystals. And then you get King Mog Mog, it's like, wait, he's a myth, he's not a real deity. Then you get, Ramuh, who's not aggressive towards you. Then you get Shiva, who is a person with this primal summoned within. And so it's always worth remembering that, including with information we're learning now.
Interesting.
True. That's good.
Yes. So there is an Echo flashback in this MSQ patch. Do either of you want to just give us the biggest, like, what was the main takeaway from this flashback that we see with this guy named Durante, or I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right,
Durante,
and Zero, and then this other mage character? What did we need to get lore wise from that?
Honestly, the biggest thing that is confusing that cutscene, if I can say, is that Durante is Golbez. Golbez takes up the armor of the character you're seeing the perspective of. You don't hear their voice. That's not Golbez. Well, he is Golbez. They are Golbez. But then their armor is taken, when they are defeated, Durante takes up Golbez's armor. If you look, Durante not only has Golbez's voice, but is wielding Golbez's greatsword. And that confused a lot of people. Because he also takes his friend's name.
So essentially, the big thing to take from that entire Echo memory is that you are seeing it from the mage's point of view. That confirms that the Memoria belongs to him. So the swordsman that you've been dealing with this whole time is actually Gobz, who took his friend's name, took his friend's armor, and uses his own sword against you. So of course something happened to his friend in which he got sealed in the Memoria. Who did it? We don't know. But when it happened, apparently, I guess his friend just vowed, I will take up your name, I will take up your armor, I will do everything in my power to honor you and see our dream fulfilled.
You can make your name the name of a hero.
Exactly.
Right? Something like that.
Yeah. So that's the entire takeaway, is that it is the mage's memory.
I think the most interesting thing about the mage is that the lack of voice acting could be a number of reasons, because they want to choose to obfuscate it more. The other thing that's worth pointing out, though, is that this mage was one of the Warriors of Light, was a Memoria of the 13th. Also drew not only Durante to them, but tried to ally themselves with Zero. Was one of the only people pulling people to their side and trying to ally, which we know is like one of the big problems with the 13th during the Contra Memoria is no one was trusting each other. Everyone was backstabbing each other. Like, that's the thing you get over. It's the thing we got from a Nuclear High, like in 3.x. But we're getting that more and more and more confirmed that was the state of things now. What is like... I don't want to get like over theorizing here, but like specifically that's like supposed to be the nature of the shards of Azem. Like, and so the fact that it's unvoiced specifically, the fact that it's that disposition seems to imply that's where they're going with it, but it may be something else entirely.
So many people have been theory crafting who the 13th shard of the Zem is for you.
Oh my god, it's gone. Oh my god. I've heard Zero, I've heard Golbet. I think I heard like Rubicante at one point. I know.
There were some saying that Diablos is the Warrior of Light.
Yes. I've heard that. Oh my god. There are some ones where I'm like, honey, please. Like there's like, I know there's scant evidence, but there's at least enough to know it's not that.
Darling, sweetie, summer child, please.
Well, and then here's the funny part where we get to 7.0 and all of a sudden Diablos. Yes, I was the Warrior of Light all along.
Oh, God.
Do you think we will ever have an actual character for Azem, or are they just going to keep him as this legendary, mythical character?
Oh, no, they are never going to elaborate on Azem, simply because since Azem is the player, to elaborate on Azem is to take away agency from the player. So I never see them doing that, ever.
I totally agree for the exact same reason. I hope they don't. And I think part of it too is it's a little wonky how much sundered shards of people end up looking the same, because you have Arbor, and it's like he doesn't look the same as you, but also he does look the same as Meteor. So technically he does look the canonical player character he's a mirror of, and then you have characters like in this most recent patch with Ericthonios and Claudian, and like looking similar. So it's not, and but also there's the Sahagin, who is a bearer of the soul of an ancient, because the Echo in 2.x, and we're assuming none of the ancients look like a Sahagin. So that's unclear if there has to be a 1-to-1 in appearance.
But when it comes to souls, like, it's entirely freeform. It can do whatever it wants.
Yeah.
But so that leads to a situation where like, I don't think they will. Even in the short stories, when they refer to as Zem, you have an option to choose between, pronouns to define it. So even in current canon, not that they couldn't like retroactively shift that, but like current canon, it's a bit ambiguous. And I totally agree with what Scribe's saying. I think it decreases agency. I think Azem's always more wonderful as a character that we know all the characters who are around them, and the negative space where they are forms our understanding of them as well as our understanding of ourselves.
I 100% agree. By defining Azem by what they're not, you get a better appreciation of who they were.
Interesting.
And even just their convocation crystal, like, doesn't have memories of them in particular, but it does have their magics. And what is the ultimate representation of them is bringing the stars together, like, is uniting people. So they already are symbolically a perfect representation of the Warrior of Light.
And jumping down the volcano for some grapes.
It's pound level grapes. Great. Yeah.
That is canonical. Azem likes grapes.
Yeah. Our goddamn island for it.
So we finally get to fight Gobz. and he turns the arena into a cube. Was that just a stylistic choice, or was there something that I missed from FF4 about that?
I mean, not really.
Yeah, I think that's for the arena. Yeah.
I replayed 4 recently. I haven't replayed After Years yet or anything, but I can't think of anything that specifically harkens to. It may be that they just wanted to not do another disc again, because there's been a lot of like floating discs. It may be. I know. I think I don't remember where I saw someone pitched this that I thought was cool. It is harkening back to Zodiark because he's still fueled to some extent potentially by the aether of Zodiark, like some of the aether beneath of Zodiark that he may have been grabbing from. And we know when we do the Dark Below, right, you have the whole turning dais cube thing going on there. But it may just be harkening back onto that. It may just be an asset reuse of that to some extent.
Yeah, Final Fantasy IV references turning Ashdai into the Shadow Dragon, which anyone who's played Final Fantasy IV saw that coming. We were wild.
It's disrespectful because it's like he already has a sword. Why use the dragon as a blunt object to like make it?
Understand? Well, now it's a dragon sword.
But is it just because it's cooler and therefore does more damage?
Yeah, I like that. Yeah,
a whole dragon to concussion just to.
Now it does like double damage. This is how it works.
Oh, okay. So I want to ask all of you, and just be honest. So, how many times did your party wipe during that MSQ trial? Because I think we went through about 3 wipes before we actually cleared that first just general MSQ trial. So we'll just the normal one. Go ahead, Elio. How many times?
I don't know. I'm trying to remember. I don't think we wiped on that. I think we might have wiped on one of the things in Pandemonium like once, but I wiped on the normal mode.
Interesting. Shiloh?
No, I didn't wipe on the normal one, but the extreme though.
Yeah, that's a good fight.
It's a good fight, but
Wild on that.
messing people up, bro. Like,
Yeah.
People. I swear the amount, and I kind of understand it because if you haven't done like Memoria Miseria, like you don't remember like the swings from fighting Varus and stuff. But I remember doing so much of that like when he started bringing out the swings and the back swing, I felt so ready. I was like, it's time. Let's do this.
yeah,
Nice. That's great. How many times did you wipe?
Well, I didn't wipe on the normal, but now I'm kind of jealous. All my friends have been going to other servers. I haven't even touched the extreme yet.
Yeah.
The worst.
I'm gonna say you are all liars and wiped at least 3 times.
Yep. We'll go with that.
Was the only wipe like 8 times. The only thing I really remember from that fight was that as soon as the fight started, someone said in party chat, like, I'm streaming on Twitch, don't forget to wave and say hi. And I'm just sitting here going, well, you're being recorded by a lore nerd, so ha.
yeah.
So
Maybe we could go right now.
right.
Go right now, like.
So we beat Gobz, and he turns into a normal sized Gobz. Did I miss anything? Why did that happen?
Aether fueled.
Yeah.
I mean, we've seen size stuff like that.
Honestly, with enough ether, you could do that to. It's more of like, imagine it like a big costume of ether. Like once the ether is spent, oof, there it goes. It's gone.
I see.
It's not quite a glamour because it's physical, but like it's the same kind of concept.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So we beat Gobz, and a bunch of stuff happens to set up for 6.5, including Zeramis. So I just want to leave it up to either you or Scribe. Who wants to take the lead here? What exactly did we get out of this ending scene after we beat Gobz and this shadowy haze just comes out of the crater? What did we learn? What was the lore implications, and where is this taking us to 6.5?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, a back and forth might be better for this because I feel like we both have like ideas and gesticulation that we can talk about. But the summoning of Zeramis is really interesting because one, we knew the fact that he was using Zodiark's Aether was something I was anticipating, so how he was specifically using it was what was surprising and the way he went about it. But the fusing of Zeramis' Aether with Ashdaya, at Void Sent Ashdaya, is basically you've created an incredibly powerful, highly astral entity that also specifically has a yearning to return to the source in and of itself because of Ajdaya's yearning to return home. Basically, the appearance of Reacher quickened it. So that is really interesting in and of itself. That was his ultimate plan. But also, we know now, it's hyper-specified, that the astrality of the 13th is what helps it try to reconnect to the source. So it is basically a being that in theory should be able to just tear open rifts between source and 13th. Which means that we're setting up for some kind of confrontation or some kind of incursion going on with that. Beyond that, there's a ton of other, there's so many facets of ways and directions and things that we've learned that are important, but I feel like the biggest crux of it is the creation of an entity that has the capacity to now create ready access between Source and 13th for Gobz to enact the final stages of his plan.
I completely agree with that stuff on Zeramis. And as far as Gobz is concerned, honestly, I feel like it sets up the fact that in 6.5 you have there's the chance to essentially see just how mad Gobz has become. Because, of course, he carries himself like someone who knows what he's doing, he has a master plan, and everything is going according to it. But the more, interactions you have with him, and the more you look at his plan, the more you realize he's just going through the motions. He's the guy banging on the door over and over, screaming and shouting and hoping that one day, if he hits hard enough, it'll break. He doesn't know what will happen if the 13th, rejoins the source. He doesn't know what will happen if he succeeds. All he knows is that he wants to do it.
Yeah. He's basically pulling an Elidibus, right? He's fulfilling his promise to his friend, the promise he made to his friend. And while he still recalls it, it's not like he's lost the plot in the same way that Elidibus, but he kind of lost the plot because he never really had the plot, other than salvation at any cost for any reason, and then just doing it. Yeah, right. At any cost. And that's also what makes Zero and him kind of an interesting contrast, is because I think ultimately Zero's story is coming to the wanting to restore the restoration, or at least the freeing to some extent, of her home and her people. But that, what was it, 6.3 lesson, which is it's not worth sacrifice. It's not right to sacrifice someone else just for your own salvation. And that's the thing that Rubicante, Gobz, all the fiends, especially those two. I mean, the other fiends kind of don't really, they're kind of just after for themselves. But that's the two things that they don't they will sacrifice the sword if it means being a savior, because of going through the Contra Memoria, through the way in which Rubicante lost his brother, the way in which Rubicante could not prevent the flood of darkness, and the way Gobz lost his friend and could not prevent the flood of darkness. And so that's that goal has so consumed them. It kind of in interesting ways mirrors what the Ascians were doing, right?
How so?
Well, because the Ascians effectively were, for many of them, specifically the Unsundered, it was because the Sundered always had a weird relationship, because they were always entities who lived through the world, but also regained the memories of the past, and those two things created interesting combinations. Sometimes it completely subsumed their personality, and other times you had examples like Fandaniel, where Amon never really integrated the memories of Hermes into himself to really feel like part of that. But with the Unsundered, you have people like La Habrea, Emmett, and Elidibus, who all they believed that they were their people's and their friends and the people they loved only chance at being brought back, at salvation. They were the only hope, and because of that, they would justify anything. Emmett would justify his genocide. Elidibus would justify, not only the horrors he did, but not forgetting them, just doing everything. La Habrea just went, I'm gonna just keep doing until I go insane, because he just never stopped working. So they all went mad in various ways. But it's not so dissimilar from what Gobz and Rubicante they're doing, because they're saving their people at any cost, even at the sacrifice of the lives of the Source and others.
Interesting.
Joke's on them. We've been trying to fix the 13th since the Shadowbringers role quest.
Exactly, yep. Come on, Eye, figure out how to do Eden. We got this.
We're trying to help you. Relax.
Yeah. Yeah. Just the thing is, Gobz can't trust us. The thing is that Gobz can't trust us, because that's the lesson they learned from the Contra Memoria, right?
And he's crazy.
Right. But, that's fair. But the thing is that there's no trust, so no one from the 13th can trust the Source to actually be their salvation. They believe they can be their own salvation, right? That's what makes Zero unique, is that she's learning the lesson that she can, and that it's valuable. That's why trust is an important, I think, element to this Banshee especially.
That and to include the role quest would be to canonize it, which would throw a lot of things into whack for players who never did it.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole thing. Yeah, the quests are interesting for a number of levels because of, well, that's a whole tangent.
That's an entire list. But no, yeah. I'm looking forward to 6.5. There's a lot to look forward to. The only sticking point to me is that, like Elio said earlier in this podcast, they are definitely biding their time in the sense of like dropping hints as to what the next expansion is going to be about. So I don't know. I'm curious to see how they'll wrap things up. Is it going to be that thing where like, it's going to be gently laced throughout the entire patch, or is it going to be all at once like, oh, boom, by the way, we're going here next. Bye.
We're going to Mirror City.
Well, and hopping back to an earlier conversation, I think that is where the things like the letter come into play. And I don't think the letter actually is, I mean, it could be completely on its own with nothing about it. But there's two things that are important that are tied to it. Well, not tied to it, but loosely tied to it. And that is one, Arenville and his home of Arenville, because we know from the short story that his name comes from his home. And the fact that he's going there is a weirdly specific notion. And we also hear from Thancred and Urianger during the Aether Font that they have some sort of benefactor that wants them to help do something. Now that could be someone like the benefactor that is Thancred's prior trainer, if you've done that quest in Charlian. It could be absolutely someone we have. Yeah, that is, yeah. We could be someone we don't know whatsoever that is like a benefactor in Mericidia, but the fact that we are getting Baldesian characters like Kryl and stuff associated around it are being pushed towards something is interesting. The other thing is that letter also, you could say, looks a little bit like late Allagan, like combination of like the crystalline like stuff of like the coloring of early Allag and the late Allagan like patterning, which is completely hypothesis. But what would be interesting about that if it was Korvosi, we know that Korvos has a bunch to do with Allag, but also has a lot to do with would have a lot to do with Graha, who's the G tribe from Korvos. So I do think there are seeds that are hinting towards things around places like Korvos that were also set up in 6.0. We also have a lot of, like, all of this patch content has been about dragons and war-torn places and void scent. And it's like, those are the three things that are the things of Mericidia. So it seems like that's where it's heading, but they could absolutely zag. It turns out, okay, Zero Miss is going to rend a hole into another, to another reflection. Instead, it's all in the 11th shard, or the 9th shard, or the 5th shard, or the 8th shard, or something.
Yeah, and real quick, what do we know about Mericidia at this point?
Not too terribly much. Honestly, here's the thing. Fans will want to tell you that Mericidia is X, Y, and Z, and like, this is there, and that is there, and this is like how they operate. No. We don't have any of that information. Nowhere is it ever confirmed that any of that is true. And a lot of those fan theories, they just pull out of their butts.
Or it's like a willful misinterpretation of random.
A willful misinterpretation, exactly. Yeah. Things we can confirm for certain when it comes to Mericidia is, number one, Bahamut and Tiamat once ruled there as king and queen dragons over in Mericidia. Number two, there were beast tribes there, or essentially beast tribes, that not only understood primal summoning, but were not happy with the invasion of the Allagan Empire. And that after the Third Astral Era, no one living in Mericidia trusts foreigners now. That's all we really know for certain.
But I'd also the most you can build off that is, so for instance, we have that lore about not trusting people, but to an extent, that was also true of Razat Han historically before we had gone there. Like, Razat Han had limited interaction. So, like, they would interact with, like, Hingashi and, like, they'd trade with people, but they were very wary about the outside. But by the time we get there, it's pretty ready access. So it's possible that, for instance, we find out that, okay, that was true about the interaction between Mericidia and all of Eorzea, but they have actually a very specific, like, Hingen consult in, like, the island that's in the northeastern section of it. But yeah, even the peoples, the only thing we know is that man ended up coming there sometime around the Second Astral Era, thanks to, like, Graha during, like, 5.4. So we know Tiamat and Bahamut were there at least during the Second Astral Era or earlier. We know that the peoples that were there must be the Zervan's peoples, like the Centaur Scaly people. You've got the living trees that are the Sephiroth people. And then we have Sophia, who, because of her the people that get summoned around her, implies that there are Rogadin, Elizin, and Hyur there, but even that. It's unclear. And that's just 3 peoples. We don't know if like, the entirety of Mara City is divided between those 3, or if there's like just one section.
No, it is all speculation at this point.
Yeah.
We don't know. And honestly, I'm okay with not knowing exactly what's going on in Mara City because there's so much about the 3 great continents we still haven't seen, explored, or understand that I kind of want to know. That's why I made that entire video making fun of the fact that they have an unclouded Ilsabard. Because we've had 3 different instances of us going up to Ilsabard, doing things there. And then finally, when Endwalker happened, we go up to Garlemald, which was the big thing we knew what was up in Ilsabard in the first place. And now that mystery is gone, come on, guys.
Yeah.
It's time to give up the ghost.
It's interesting because we have Wurlia and Bosnia, which we know are the respective, effectively western coast with Wurlia and eastern section with Bosnia. We know we have Nalmask beneath the Magna Glacius. We know we have Corvos on the sea. We know there's Landis somewhere in there. So it's there's a lot of places that are defined, and so it would be shocking to me to not... It'd be shocking to me not have at least one map in 7.0 on Ilsabard and then uncloud cover that, because... I was fine with Endwalker because I'm okay, it's just Garlemald. We're not in those sections. Maybe they want to save that for once they want to really define. Because right now, the spatial existence of where Bosnia is compared to where Corvos is very strange, because Bosnia is a major powerhouse, but also if Corvos is where Corvos should be because the anchorite of Corvos, Bosnia's got to be the most tiny-ass country in the world. And Zadnor also would have to be tiny, so... That's a whole thing, too.
I mean, if you remember, Elio, they even forgot where Dalmasca was in EE Volume 1.
Oh, because they name it don't they say Ilsabard instead of Othard?
No, they historically said that Dalmasca was the first city-state that Garlemald invaded when they started moving south, which is impossible.
And is that even
there were other countries. So, there was that typo in EE Volume 1.
Not so much in their defense, but at least they did rectify it specifically in EE2.
One of the, I think really the last thing that I want to bring up about the patch was at the end there was a crystal that fell into the crater or something. Well, can when do you explain that?
It's the Friends Memorial.
That was in the Memoria.
Gotcha.
The fact that Gobz didn't react to it falling down the pit, that should tell you something about him.
Yeah. And I think that's going to play a function to some extent, some point. I mean, the other important thing to remember is because he's a Memoriate, because his friend was a Memoriate before the Flood of Darkness, his friend would not be a Void Sent. So that would potentially allow for something like a rejoining if they were the 13th Shard of Azim or one of the... I think that role, that Memoria definitely has a role to play before all is done. We'll see if it's a 6.5 or later thing.
Watch the Warrior of Light become 9 times rejoined and everyone is still 7.
And the patch ends with us getting the hell out of there, and we get back to Razadhan, and everyone's pretty sad, and that is basically where the patch ended. So I want to ask all of you guys, what was your take at the end? Did you enjoy it? Did you think they could have done more? Did it just feel like all filler? How did you see it, Elio?
Yeah, no, look, I loved it. Going back to the top, right? I think each one of these patches have felt like it is a similarly sized, if even not quite in scope of grandness, but sized step forward in the plot. It feels like by the time we get to 6.5, each section feels like it's one step forward to the climax that will be 6.55 probably. And so I was always expecting an Empire Strikes Back ending here at the end of 6.4, so I felt like this is the story I expected with details that surprised me, and I feel satisfied in so much of what I have come to expect from a delivery of a patch, right? Do I want more? You bet your ass. But within the confines of what 14 does, I thought it was a very good.
Describe.
I will always say this: 14 could always do with more world building. Always. Because it's such a character-driven plot that they often forget how important world building is sometimes. So the fact that we did have little, like, a few things tied up, like what made the 13th special when it comes to the portals, what the true fate of the pieces of Zodiark, and things like that. I was content with that. And then, of course, then they throw a curveball at you with Pandemonium, and then I'm like, oh, okay, did you forget what you were doing this whole time? But for the most part, I was more or less satisfied. If anything, how they treat 6.5, or as Elio said, 6.55, will ultimately inform me as to did they know what they were doing, or were they just kind of throwing crap at the wall hoping that it sticks? So you can't really judge a story until you've read the final chapter. So
yeah,
it's
a good point. It's a very good point. I was under the impression that the Scions of the Seventh Dawn had disbanded, and yet here we are again, doing stuff with the Scions.
I thought we was done with y'all.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because they even in this patch point out that we don't have access to some of the things that we would as the Scions, some of the official means and ends. And I guess, I'm sympathetic to the fact that it's like, okay, if you're all hanging out together, you're everything in Scions, but everything but name. But I do think I would point out that Endwalker and Zophon the know, right, we've disbanded, at least officially for now. So there's never, I think, the implication amongst those characters that they're not going to be doing things together. And also, there's a feeling that everyone is still split off and doing their own thing. Like, while they come back for the patches, we have to remember from our perspective, we're only seeing them at these key moments. But they're, like, Thancred and Ariadne are off doing their own thing. Y'shtola is focusing on her research. The twins are exclusively in Garlemald. So
where's Graha at?
Helping the students with the Mists of the Realm stuff.
Ah, right.
Yeah.
So people are, Graha is helping Baldesion instead of, like, the Scion specifically. So I do think there's something to be said that they are broken up. It just, because we're still hanging around them, it doesn't feel that different.
I see. Okay. So where do we go from here in 6.5 is my next question. I know Thancred was, talking about some stuff, but how do you see 6.5 ending? We'll start with you, Ilyu.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, with 6.5, I think, what was the Yoshi P comment specifically? He kind of mentioned early on in the patch cycle that he expected 6.5 to be more of a hard pivot towards going into the expansion, which I think makes sense because we have everything's been the Void Cent related up to this point, and I think it's going to more strongly pivot in 0.5. Yeah. I think, like, there's two possibilities you have to assume. Either Gobz is going to bide his time a little bit while Zero Mist regains his strength, or it's going to be ready to go by 6.5. Because if it's ready to go by 6.5, it means that, like, it's going to start incursions quickly, and that's going to start, because his end game is ready. It's like, it's going to break holes, and those holes are going to be Void Cent are probably going to be able to come through in their full form, not just like in their soul that they have to occupy something. An alternative is that 6.5, if we go with something like, let's say it's Mericidia. It doesn't have to be, but let's say it is Mericidia or the New World. If 6.5 is mainly rooted in setting up why we're going to that place, and then 6.55's finale is Zero Mist, like, breaking into the world, but like breaking into the world in Corvos or like just making portals throughout the world, it then means that we have a reason to, like, go into the specific place for the expansion while also contending with this prior threat. The alternative possibility is that we completely defeat Zero Mist in 6.5 and 6.55. It seems a little bit odd, and it seems a little bit weird to, like, wrap that all up in one go after just establishing it this patch, but it's possible.
Yeah.
It's like, but, like, who, because, it needs, like, an extreme trial and everything like that, so it was going to be, like, the trial boss.
Right. Well, and it's also interesting because we didn't have a trial series this time, but we also have, because we don't have a trial series, but we also have the 3 trials that we got from so far with Gobz, Barbariccia, Rubicante. Am I missing? Is there one other trial that we got? No, I think that's it.
Nazo, whatever. That's the other fiend.
Yeah, because Nazo and Scarmiglione were both dungeon bosses.
Yeah.
So it's like we have room for one more trial. So it could happen. The thing is that the cadence of this patch cycle is the most akin it's been to is a Realm Reborn. Because if you look at 0.3, 0.4, and 0.5, it's always 0.1 to 0.3 is an epilogue for the expansion. 0.4, 0.5 is setup. But this has been all setup / maybe its own contained story. So whether or not it intends to be a story that finishes as a patch cycle and then we move on, but it have ramifications from it in the future, or this is part of the lead up, drastically changes what happens in the next patch.
Yeah, I'm actually glad you brought that up, because one comment that I read that I really wanted to get your take on was, I read a comment on Reddit that said, finishing the story in 6.0 and doing a separate story from 6.1 to 6.5 was a mistake. Was that a mistake?
Well, I mean, we don't know if it's a separate story yet, so, I mean, it kind of, I mean, I guess I just think that premise is slightly flawed, but I also think no, because one, this is, I think for me, in some ways, I'm a little disappointed how much this is a continuation of events of the past, because 6.0 is a finale, and I'm not really disappointed, but I wasn't expecting them to so tie the 13th, its legacy, and all this stuff is things that have been being built up majorly in the background from really 2.0 onwards. You know, and so, I mean, you in every expansion, you've had a major aspect of the Void be somewhat relevant to greater or lesser degrees, especially in like Heaven's Word, or, you know, in Shadowbringers or in Endwalker. So I guess I can't agree, and I also don't know that I would make a judgment call until after we've seen the whole story. I think Scribe put it perfectly. Scribe, that was a perfect way of putting it. Don't judge the book until you finish the final chapter, right? To paraphrase.
Bro, I think I understand where that person is coming from. I think I know what they meant. I think what they were essentially saying is that to finish the End of Days, to wrap up the Endsinger and that entire thing, the Hydaelyn Zodiac arc, which has been done from 2.0 to 6.0, to finish all that, before you're even given the chance to breathe. Oh, by the way, there's another world-ending event happening. Go get
Check it out.
And that's so. I can definitely see that if someone tells me that they feel that the whole Void plot feels forced, I can't exactly tell them they're entirely wrong.
Sure. And to be fair, I guess I don't think that's a byproduct of being standalone, right? I think the problem of threat scale and the problem of like having to deal with things that are world-ending or is like you can make it completely standalone or interact or like think that's completely coming off the back of that. Either way, that is a problem I think of partly MMO structuring, where you need to have a threat that's of a certain scope and scale. Not have to, but tends to for like leading into an expansion or for a threat that looms. I think one of the 14's strengths tends to be that because it's rooting it in character, it's not important that Gobz is a worse threat than Medion, because he's not, right? He's not ending the universe or anything. But what he does is he presents a threat to home and the source. And really the root of conflict is based more in people like, not just the people we care about and the myriad of peoples, but, you know, we get a different perspective. We get the perspective of some character like Zero. And because we're rooting this narrative also at about how do you try to help the 13th in the right way, I think it still ends up being a continuation of a lot of the similar themes that we're coming from the prior expansions. I think,
totally. Yeah, because like the entire reason this, for lack of a better term, the reason this entire Void arc is able to happen in the first place is because of the events of 6.0, because of what we did to Zodiac and the finale of everything. So
Fallout.
Yeah, exactly. It's the fallout. It's the explosion happened. Now we get the shockwave. And once the shockwave is over with, then it's a question of like, okay, now that the dust is settled, where are we?
I see. I've been asking this question a lot lately, but I think this is just for myself, but Elio, can you is Zero gonna make it to 7.0?
That's my bad.
I see. I can't imagine. I mean, look. I guess I can imagine a world in which you spend all this time building her up in order to have her be okay, she's learned the lesson, so she at the last moment she can stand in defense of her world and sacrifice herself. Yada yada. I think that is the least interesting possible version of Zero, and I deeply hope they don't do that. And I don't think they will. I also think that one of the things you're seeing is, I mean, people being somewhat tired of the old Scions and wanting things to be able to change. And I think the only way, especially because of how it tends to be, they want to have, like, relatively speaking, tends to be like 7 Scions with us, right? Whether it was Shadowbringers, whether it was Endwalker, I think you have to rotate cast out. if you want to rotate people in. So if they say that Kryle's going to be a bigger part, so I would expect like Kryle or Zero to be a part of 7.0, which allows them to also phase out characters. Like if this ends with, okay, we've actually found ways to get from source to first now because of something like Zero Miss, or because Yustola's whole story since the end of Shadowbringers has really been about figuring cross-planar travel. And so like this is like all coming to a head in 6.x. And if she was able to get back to the first, I mean, she'd go probably spend time with Runar. Cool, you have a reason why Yustola's phased out. Thancred and Urianger seem to be going to like starting kind of like do their own thing. So there's reason that they could be phased out. And we could get, okay, that's 3 slots. Now you get someone from Ericidia. And I know that that's kind of talking from a gameplay standpoint, why you're rationalizing character writing choices, which I don't think is always, which is not a good idea usually. But I think it holds, I think there's merit there to point that out as reasons why there's a lot of good reasons to keep Zero. And there's not a lot that would be, there's not that it would be a lot to be gained by her dying just to save the 13th. There's much more for her to be gained by having her live to save the 13th and to experience the world and to be an ambassador for the world she comes from.
Yeah.
No, you see, neither is going to happen. Once the fucking MSQ is wrapped up, Zero's going to go back to working at Hot Topic. That's what's going to happen.
That are working out with Justinian.
She needs to sell more hats to tip, so...
I think I saw a comment where someone said that there's about 8 hat tips this patch.
If you made a drinking game out of that, you get alcohol poisoning so fast, it'd be crazy.
No, but honestly, I do agree with Elio on that one. Because, like, look at it this way. After the Shadowbringers role quests, basically you have characters from the first looking at the 13th and asking themselves, how can we fix this? Now, imagine if those people from the first started working with Zero while she's in the 13th. Now you have people on both sides looking at each other going, how do we solve this problem? So while Zero is tending to the void itself, you have the researchers in the first tending to, like, the method behind the madness, so to say.
And so much more interesting.
I mean, it's like interesting. Yeah.
It's like bring Lucia and Maxima, right, with the Ilsabardian contingent. Even if they haven't done enough with them that's hyper compelling, bringing them with is more interesting than just having it be Eorzea and Garleans, right? Like there be finding a way forward between peoples is just more interesting. It's always going to be more interesting than just like domination or one side winning or one side dictating.
Honestly, throwing Garleans at Garleans was the best thing the story could have done. Just
that's also totally.
No, yeah, the moment they were just like, you have betrayed your home, is just like, you betrayed yourself. Shut up.
Right. Well, and that confluence of what it means to move forward and like what Garlean pride means. And like Euless is such a great character. Euless is such a great character because he's not a character who started out joining Eorzea like Lucia or Maxima. He's a character who started out with like a very traditional sense of Garlean pride and is desperately trying to find a better way forward for his people and his world, and sees what that means and sees what the benefit of Eorzeans and sees that we're trying to help and gets that, but also still represents a much more traditional and conservative aspect of Garlean society that you can't ignore. If you just ignore it, that's going to come back in an ugly way at some other point. So that's why I think Euless is a vital character for anything to do with that plot.
I see. Interesting. Is there anything about this patch that either of you want to bring up? Anything that you want to talk about? Because I think that's we pretty much covered everything that I had in mind.
You want to talk about Pandemonium?
Through Pandemonium.
Oh, Pandemonium. What do we say? Why did you have to make Evilise more relevant?
No, I guess barely. Are you kidding me? There was the option to say, like, oh, you mean Ultima from the Evilise raid? And they're like, who's that? Never heard of her. Moving on.
I mean, you're right. Well, and also the way to which it's like, the High Seraph probably had something to do with the Heart of Sabik, but at one point we're unsure, and to what extent we're unsure. But stay tuned, folks, which...
No, and then the fact that this is the first time that they've ever used the phrase Black Orosite in the English dub.
Okay, yeah, I was going to say, in the English.
In the English, this is the first time it's ever popped up, but in the Japanese, it's been around since, like, 2.0. So now you have this massive disconnect between different languages.
Yeah. I mean, I remember having to explain. Oh man, I've actually, to be fair, I think I've been having to explain that since I've been doing content. It was like when people are like, "Oh, what is white Orosite?" And then also I explained black. One time I explained black Orosite, and they're like, "Ah, so they're the two poles, white Orosite, black." I'm like, "No, that's not how." Okay,
That's like trying to explain that entire Astral and Umbral Aether cutscene with Urianger to people. Because that cutscene, like, he uses different keywords based on the language you hear it in. And like, trying to explain that cutscene to people that just don't get it can be a nightmare.
Yeah, it definitely. That's why I just stick with, okay, Astral, change. Just
Astral,
Astral, change. Yeah, just change. Anytime you see Umbral, passivity. That's what's being said.
Don't screw light, screw darkness. All you need to understand is Astral active, Umbral passive. That's it.
No. Yeah. Yep.
Wow.
No, I'll say, like, from a combat standpoint, from a musical standpoint, Anabasios was great. I think one thing is setting aside.
Oh yeah, the music is
Stoken just doesn't know when to stop making bangers.
Well, this thing that I love, the reason I love Soken's, like, there's many reasons I love Soken's music, but the thing is that he did it again here is he used motifs, right? He used, for 11, he used the Amaranthine motif. For, if you go into P12, it's the combination of the main themes during, it's like Scream and, I'm forgetting his name, P4s though. And so it feels simultaneously familiar and fresh and new and energizing and exciting. Setting aside, though, whether or not, I guess I have a question for some of you guys. Setting aside whether or not the fact that Themis soul is in the source is utter bullshit. That final cutscene was voiced, which I had deeply appreciated, and I hope sets a precedent going forward that we're just going to see, like, Alliance raids and/or raids are just voiced.
Oh, I would totally be on board for seeing more voice acting, period.
Please. Yeah.
Please.
But the other thing is, that final cutscene, what he conveys to you is so interesting to me, because I feel like going through 6.0, the final conversation you have with Elidibus, to me, already conveyed, like, the subtext of everything he says at the end of Anabasios is in that conversation. It's just that Anabasios makes it text instead. So it was really interesting to watch some people who felt like that was a beautiful scene, I don't feel I needed it, and other people who I don't feel like understood the subtext of the conversation during his sending you to Elpis get played out in a much more, like, specific and concise way. Did you guys feel any of that?
Well, all I know for certain is that I made a joke tweet about Elidibus's voice on that little cute baby face.
She's so good.
Okay, here's the problem with that tweet. It is the most popular thing I've ever created, and it started a flame war.
Of course it did.
You made it, Scribe.
Oh my god.
Mission engagement.
Yeah.
Oh my god. So, because, like, for the most part, people were kind of laughing and joking alongside me, like, yeah, the voice doesn't, like, 100% one-to-one match such a youthful complexion. But on the other side, you had the people that just didn't get the joke at all, saying, like, what are you talking about? We've known this is his voice since this expansion. How are you so stupid? And I'm sitting there going, that's not the joke. The joke is amount of people face, though.
It's like that's it. Not like
oh my god.
The amount of people who will not even, I don't even know if willfully, but, like, miss the point. Like the point is not whether or not the voice is good. The point is pointing out, maybe it's a little weird to have a little bottom boy have a deep voice. Yeah. I think my one counterpoint to that is just to say Rick Astley and to hang up the phone.
No, and honestly, I'll say it here for the record. I think the voice actor nailed it. Just such a good, like, voice for that character. I just think it's kind of funny that you would, like, if you did not know that voice going in, if you saw Elidibus, or Themis in this case, his little baby face, that is not the voice you would expect. Ever. Not in a million years. He would open his mouth and you'd be like, excuse you?
It's like hearing a lot of deep voice, yeah.
Can you say that one more time for me?
It's like
you don't see his... Oh my god, now I'm just thinking of oh my god, I forget his name, but the Crystal Braves guy.
The Lalafell.
Yeah.
The Japanese.
But the thing about theme, like the thing that's interesting to me about so in 6.0, when you only see the bottom of his face, right? When you hear Themis start talking with Elidibus' voice, but you never actually see the top of his face. You only see the bottom of his face, right?
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to think if anyone could actually enter like Abysso. Well, no, because they reveal he's Elidibus and Abysso, so no one should be surprised.
But everyone knew it was Elidibus.
Yeah.
No one stepped into that.
Yeah, like anyone who was surprised that was Elidibus are also the people that don't know that the Echo and Blessing of Light are different things.
Well,
that is a whole other tangent, but thank you. There's someone else saying it other than me this time.
No, Elio, the amount of times I get a comment that's saying like, wait a minute, isn't the Blessing and Echo the same thing? I'm like, oh my god, man.
Like, look, since I'm usually the one saying literally what you're saying, I'll be the one who's slightly more sympathetic this one. It's like,
oh no, my patience ran out ages ago.
Yeah, if you're not paying close attention, understanding the distinction can be kind of hard, but also 5.3 exists and 5.2 exists, and please just go replace the MSQ if you haven't in a while. It'll help loads. Did someone say something about Gobz's voice?
Yeah, no, I was gonna say I thought Gobz's voice actor was probably my favorite voice actor of all.
They knocked it out of the park. Honestly, the voice cast for 14. And I will give the voice cast like that 1 point for Final Fantasy 14. While the translation and the language interpretations aren't always 1-to-1 like they should be, the voice actors themselves always do a phenomenal job. They always knock it out.
Having worked in localization, I'm a little bit more sympathetic to the localization for this game, I will say. And that's mostly because not just the amount of work that's having to be done, but also a byproduct of like literal translation can sometimes actually convey the wrong meaning. Because of
True. My point is that it happens so often in 14.
Sure. And I'm not saying it can't be improved. I think a really good example is Blackheart, right? Not making that a clear aspect of the Heart of Sabik and omitting it in English provides confusion not only now, but also when it's clarified that it's Oracite. That's already hinted at in the Japanese because of like the notion of white Oracite and black Oracite and Oracite in general. Whereas you can only kind of start to understand that. I guess what's the earliest point? When they start bringing in the Luca V Oracite is probably the point in which you can start realizing, oh, Oracite are containers for thing? Non-aspected crystal. This seems kind of like, and I would say that's the thing is like, one thing I would say in defense of 14 seeding, whether it happens too much or too little or whatever your preference is, the thing that's nice is the amount of times they'll seed something very early on, but they'll actually provide a lot of lore bits that allow you to start making much more informed guesses about the nature of something. But I think a good point like against it, right, is you end up with things like you set up Eureka beneath the Crystal Tower at the end of the Crystal Tower raid. Then they use Eureka as a name for the idea of Val and that whole thing. And they create Eureka Orthos later, which, okay, cool, they paid off what they were going to do with Eureka beneath the Crystal Tower, but it's also like that took so long, it was like, is this just a drop plot thread? And so, like, if things feel like a drop plot thread, then it's, it can be understanding why that's frustrating.
Yeah.
Well, I think variant dungeons are great. That's going to...
Criterion dungeons are like a lore fan's, like, dream. I love the Criterion dungeon for old...
so good.
The problem, kind of turning back to what Elio said, is essentially, like, if I'm learning more about something big in Final Fantasy 14 from a character card on a statue that I can buy from Square Enix. If I can learn more about Ultima from her statue than the actual in-game lore, someone's made a mistake. Using transmedia to any great extent is a problem. I think the most iconic probably example of that in Final Fantasy is 15. The amount of like things you need to engage with to make Final Fantasy 15 is a mess.
Final Fantasy 15 is a mess, and like Final Fantasy 15 is honestly still a mess, even if you watch Kingsglaive and watch the anime and but I think it's a good example of transmedia failing. And one of the things that I think is interesting is Yoshi P recently commented this on 16, how he thought that transmedia issue is kind of a failing. And I think when 14 does it, like Scribe is saying, like a Seraph, high Seraph statue, or then I think it's bad, especially if it's a key thing. I think the gray zone, I think the best example of the gray zone that they have is the Encyclopedia Eorzea, because pretty much everything in here is either a lot of things are taken from either like a lot of the character things you'll see in here are actually just from Triple Triad cards, but a lot of times it's clarification that was already semi-present in the game or becomes apparent pretty readily once it's necessary. So there are aspects of metaphysics that I think are explained in Encyclopedia Eorzea Volume 1 that are never made explicit up until like the Montaigne conversation in some ways. But the thing is, the MSQ will always convey to you the information you need to know in order to make sense of a plot point that is coming up or relevant. But I'm totally with you, Scribe, that like transmedia, if your transmedia is in any way vital, something that's outside of the text, outside of the game is vital, it's just bad. That's just, don't do that.
No, exactly. And that's why I get some people that ask me like, oh, why don't you cover the lore that they talk about in the live letters? And I'm sitting there going like, okay, so you want me to cover lore that, number one, didn't make it into the game, didn't make it into the books, didn't make it into the side stories on their website, and was only loosely brought up as an offhanded question on a live letter. I don't count that as reliable lore, even if it's from Yoshi P's mouth himself. Because,
well, Yoshi P's usually speculating. Like, he's not even, like, he'll say that.
Exactly, because the way I see it is, if they were confident in that data, whatever it is, it would be somewhere. But it wasn't. So, no. I remember a lot of people got on Anonymous's case about something. I think it had something to do with the Heaven's Word. And in an interview, one of the writers said that, oh, the members of the Heaven's Word were, like, diet tempered. And that's why they were so, like, dedicated to the cause of the Pope and stuff. And I'm sitting here going, okay, that is not brought up anywhere in Final Fantasy XIV. It's not brought up in the game, the books, the side stories, anything. So, as people wanted to get on Anonymous's case about that with the tempering things, I say no. Anonymous is right. They were not tempered in the story. They couldn't have been, because it was never brought up and it would have been obvious.
Hold one thing there. I think there is a difference between there's no good answer and that's frustrating is different than they couldn't have been, right? Because, like, the timeline for their tempering and their capacity to transform, and also, for instance, if you transform, it's like because they are part of the Knights 12, that effectively causes self-tempering. Like, you could speculate things, but the story never tells you, and it's a problem the story doesn't tell you.
Well, the problem with that is that they brought up diet tempering,
diet tempering's bold. That's just
or loose tempering. It's like, oh, so they were tempered, but not really. So you're not only are you going to bring up lore that was never addressed in game, but you're going to bring up a type of tempering that's never addressed in game.
Yeah,
and now there are two different layers of bullshit. We're in pandemonium Elidibus levels of territory of nonsense.
Yeah, totally.
This is gonna be a meme for a while, Elio, by the way. The Elidibus soul.
Look, someone is gonna try to, the initial answer is gonna be something offhand that they try to give us that is, like, not gonna quite work. Just you wait. Like, a live letter, Yoshi P's gonna get it. Someone's gonna give an answer that, like, kind of works but doesn't really, and then we're gonna get something in EE4 that I'm like, okay, legally you are correct about everything you said, Oda, but that's still like,
doesn't justify how poorly written that was.
Yeah. But I think another example of the transmedia, actually, beyond the Encyclopedia Eorzea, is the short stories, which most of them are non-key lore. Many of them are just about contextualizing characters with information you either already know or don't know, but is really more about their characterization than it is anything to do with any plot related. I think the strongest example of one that is actually, I won't say vital, but relevant, and this patch confirmed for the first time, is the 8th Arm of Calamity timeline continues to exist. And that's only important in terms of conversations around time travel, which is not, that's a whole can of worms we won't even, I'm like,
no, we're not touching time travel.
Yeah. But the important thing there is that all of the short stories are free, incredibly easy to access, and like, yes, they're outside of game, but it literally have links almost, like, there's many links throughout the game that allow you to get into them. So to me, the short stories are okay, but again, occupy that gray area. Like, it's like where you're, like, starting to edge towards, if you put Another good example of the short stories is we had one with Euless, Aaronville. So we had one with Euless, which kind of feels like set up for 6.4, which there's nothing important in it that tells you about 6.4. But all it does is just kind of give you more of its interior feeling in the events post 6.0. But it's kind of a similar conversation to what happens in 6.0, where he's talking about, what he had to do with his family. And then also in 6.4, where he's talking about how do we find our way forward. It's basically just that in a short story. And then you have the Aaronville short story, where he's the first time he mentions that his name comes from his home city. And that maybe one day he's going to return there. So the thing is that you could say like, well, they kind of hinted at that like during 6.1 or 6.2 with that short story. But because the MSQ tells you it anyways, it's not vital to read that short story. It's just fun to preemptively potentially know little bits or be able to theorize off of it.
No, the short stories are, for better or for worse, both good and bad. Because like Elio said, they can contextualize things you already know. Like, for instance, we knew that the Charlians saw what happened to Louis Soir.
Yeah.
And the short story of the twins essentially looking through the telescope and seeing what happened to Meteor or Talmud, sorry, is essentially canon. We know that they know this, but getting to hear their perspective and how, like, the knowledge that it killed their grandfather destroyed them, it kind of tugs at your heartstrings a bit. And that's a good example.
Yeah.
Exactly. It helps provide information for the binding quotes. But then you have weird introductions of like side stories on the website, because like, for instance, the way they explain how Estinian got his new set of dragon armor was by going to like essentially the Ratatosker's domain and essentially saying like, hey, I know this is weird coming from me, but the war is over and I hope that gives you some level of peace. And of course, big moody boy comes over, Ray Smelger. He's all like, oh wow, I didn't expect to see you here. And he's like, I want to show you something. And he like bestows upon him the pureblood armor, which makes sense. We already knew that armor was made pre-Dragon Song War. But here's the problem. This is what confused a lot of people, is that he said Dragoons existed before the war. The problem with that statement is that it's not the Dragoons we know. The Dragoons we know from Ishgard are dragon killers. They have built their entire fighting style for the past 1,000 years around jumping into the air and killing a dragon. That is their entire life.
Stepping in AoEs.
Yeah, and jumping off of platforms and stuff. So to assume that it's the same Dragoon is false. So it's more accurate to say there were Dragon Knights pre-Dragon Song War. That I'm not arguing. That's true. There were Dragon Knights pre-Dragon Song War. You have mounts that even say like, oh, I loved flying around with Knight on my back and stuff like that. But to assume that they were one and the same, come on, guys. Come on.
Yeah, and that's a problem of like the difference. So like, if this honestly comes down to localization again. So like, imagine you have in Japanese something that delineates a more specific aspect of that because of like how kanji can function and deliver information differently. But the line from Racefelger is supposed to, like, an important part of it is that it's very poetic or high oratory. If you like go, there were other dragoons not like you. There were dragoons. Like if you start adding more information, you can lose. Like you sometimes have to choose between tonality versus information density. And that's where a lot of problems happen in a lot of times in 14 localizations. And you're usually pretty good about it because of how the 14 localization English team works so closely with the JP team. But it's not perfect by any means. One of the nice things is, so I'm building off that. One problem is that he shows up with this new armor. They don't really explain it until I think maybe not the first time, but at least the first time I remember them nodding to it is when he shows up in 6.0 and Varshan is like, you wear the armor of a dragon and you have the blood of a dragon on your spear or something. So they do reference that it's kind of important, but that could have been a really good quest, for instance. Another example for kind of important ones, recent short stories too, is you have the Watcher short story, which explains that he was one of Vanna's convocation. Which, again, is hard because on the one hand, it's really not important that you know that. The Watcher is just someone Vanna knew. He is like the spirits of Emertine and he looks after it. And once you play Myths of the Realm, you can kind of guess, like, well, hey, there's one missing. Where is that person? Alternatively, though, you could spend all of Myths of the Realm being like, well, if they were Vanada's Convocation, who's the 13th person? Why is there no 13th person? I'm waiting for the final Myths of the Realm. There's going to be a 13th secret member of the 12 or something. And in reality, the information's out there. But if they made it a little more explicit, it might have been helpful.
Yeah, true. And then you had like that one short story where Medion, or one of the many Medions, were flying through space and going and visiting these other worlds. And you had some players saying like, oh, this story changes everything we know about the Source and Dynamis, and I'm sitting here going, it changes nothing about the Source. Why you're saying that is baffling.
It broadens, in a certain sense, what we know about the Sea of Stars, but also because we knew so little about the Sea of Stars, literally anything to patrol.
No, exactly. It's anything goes out in space, so who cares?
Right.
We had robots fighting dragons out in the void of space, so who knows what else is out there? Come on.
The biggest revelation I think that exists in that short story is the idea that there are stars of Dynamis that can form naturally as long as Dynamis coalesces firmly enough in the Sea of Stars. Like that is the problem with that is like, okay, that's kind of cool, but it also means nothing because Ultima Thule exists and we know that coalesced Dynamis is already a thing. And like you can, yes, it's manufactured by Medion, but it's still, we know it can be a thing. But also the ramifications that are completely unclear what that even supposed to, like what a star, is that a burning star of Dynamis even means? So
no, exactly.
It's cool imagery.
It's a fun idea, but since the Source and its reflections are still ethereal stars, ultimately it doesn't matter. Dynamis, I think it's hilarious how many players wanted to pretend like Dynamis changed everything about 14. That you had some people suddenly saying like, "Oh wow, Dark Knights must have been using Dynamis this whole time," and
Thank you for saying. Oh my God!
I'm sitting here going, "No, they haven't.
It works.
They've been using Aether this whole time, you idiot!"
I explained that Aether can be affected by emotion too. Just because Dynamis is impacted by emotion does not mean everything that's emotion.
It's the same thing with limit breaks, because we've known for years how limit breaks work, and then one depressed bird out in space says the word Dynamis once, and then suddenly you think that changes how limit breaks work. God damn it.
I think limit break, here's the thing I'll say in defense of like limit break being Dynamis associated. It's like, okay, it can be associated, but that doesn't mean that aetherology doesn't play any part in it.
No, exactly. Because not only do the books say that it's Aether, but you see characters actively like channeling Aether into limit breaks in like the MSQ. Remember back when Papalimo and Ida were trying to escape, like the Ulda back in ARO, right? Like, we're accused of treason. Papalimo knowingly uses magic to channel Aether into Ida so that she can perform a limit break. This wasn't a, maybe if I believe in her enough that she'll be able to perform a limit break. No, he knew what he was doing. That's not Dynamis, people.
Here's what I will say in defense. Omega as a raid block is all about understanding what allows us to use limit break and why Omega is incapable of using it. What makes us different and able to break limits? What is this unseen force? What is this thing? It has always suggested that there is some extra component to this, but it does not mean that it invalidates every other component that's already pre-existed.
Exactly. Congratulations, Final Fantasy XIV. You named the power of friendship.
Yeah. But so, like, that's the thing is, like, to me, the big mistakes with Dynamis, I think people misunderstand it, is that Dynamis is emotion, which is not correct.
That is not correct at all.
And that's explicit. That's not implicit. That is, like, explained by both the people of Elpis. It is explained by Nidana. It is, like, it is an unseen force influenced by the extremes of emotion. And Aether naturally blasts it apart, right? So the thing is, and, like, also the Omega Ultimate, right, clearly implies that there's a component of heart that is related to what gives us this extra ability. And so therefore I think, and the fact that we can use it because we are entelechy, to me assumes that there's a component of Dynamis to it, but to say that it is non-aetherological, I think is not I think, ignore... Well, while Aether can dissipate Dynamis, it doesn't mean that they are necessarily completely and irrevocably unable to be in any correlation to each other whatsoever.
No, I completely agree. I'm not... it's something I have to remind people is that I'm not saying that Dynamis plays zero role in things like Limit Break. All I'm trying to remind people is that it isn't as important as you think it is. Oh, sure, there was an entire expansion built around Dynamis, but your character is still an ethereal being on an ethereal world using ethereal abilities. So, is Dynamis there? Yeah, it is. It's floating around. You can't see or interact with it, but it's there. But everything you do is ultimately still going to be ethereal to some degree.
Oh, so I'm assuming you've definitely got the quandaries about Dynamis jobs, right?
Oh my, let me put this on the record right here, people. There's never going to be a Dynamis job.
You validated!
Yep, there's not only is there never going to be a Dynamis job, there's not even going to be a Dynamis ability.
Somebody put that.
And also defeats the purpose of how it's explained with our natural ability with as Entelechy, and also with the relationship with, like, an ethereal star. Like, while they can somewhat coexist, they're still antagonistic in a way that, like, requires extreme circumstance for it to be powerful. Okay, also...
And that's the thing.
Yeah.
The Warrior of Light is even less conductive to Dynamis because they're more rejoined than everyone.
The amount to which rejoinings creates a linear or non-linear situation around your capacity to be an Entelechy and use Dynamis is fascinating, because it's not clear if there's a full one-to-one. While rejoining with Arbor gave us the power that our soul's density was increased, it does not necessarily imply that our capacity to engage with Aether or we immediately are stronger. Also, the fact that beings of the first are not inherently so much weaker than the beings of the source we have would imply that rejoinings seem to be a non-linear effect in at least some regard.
Honestly, that's something I always hoped that they would explain, because for a 7 times rejoined person to go to the first, we should have been able to wipe the floor with people like Runji.
Assuming it's linear, yeah.
Assuming it's linear, so there's an explanation of what being a sundered entity means that the writers have just never elaborated on.
EE3, let's hope Encyclopedia Erzia Volume 3. That's our chance to talk about
Buddy, I'm praying.
Let's get on that copium train.
Once we're at the fan fest, we can, like, start, I don't know, beating people with books or something.
So the 2 lines, right? So me and you, so what we do is we just go there, we get in the lines for the 2 lines for questions, and then we just turn around to everyone and we're like, okay, you're gonna ask this, you're gonna ask this. It's like, hey, but enough of us work together, we can get the questions out.
Your questions are irrelevant. I substitute my own.
Yeah. But no, I guess carrying off that too, I want to in part 2. The flowers, the Elpis flowers, are Entelechy, but they are not, like, absorbing Dynamis and, like, using Dynamis to change color. They are Entelechy that react. Dynamis is affected by emotion, and the flowers are affected by Dynamis. That's what affects the color, right? So, there's multiple examples about the relationship of how Dynamis is not, like, Dynamis is affected by things, not necessarily just the source of something.
Yeah, and another thing people always forget is that Medion was manufactured to interact with Dynamis. We were not. Like,
just because you're an Entelechy doesn't mean it's the same.
Exactly. She was built with a particular purpose. And even though she was technically a failed experiment, she was an experiment that caused a lot of damage.
Yeah, it's also unclear the level to which, like, while we have thin Aether, even on Elpis, the level, like, thin Aether is a very ambiguous term. Like, yes, our Aether is thin compared to an Ancient's, but is Medion's even thinner than ours? Because the thinner it is, in theory, the more access she has to engage and interact with Dynamis.
Which is a valid point, because even in Pandemonium, they're like, oh, the Warrior of Light, their power rivals even our strongest Ancients, so... Okay.
Yeah.
I'm half your Aether. How?
Yeah, and they explicitly point that out, right? Like literally, La Habre is like, your Aether is too thin to be doing what you're doing, but I acknowledge you're still doing what you're doing, and that's weird.
I do wonder if they ever get to
So
the,
I feel like Elio and I have just been going crazy for the last 30 minutes.
I warned them. I sent a message warning them that this would happen, Scribe. So
no, this is great. No, what I was gonna say is I wonder if the story will ever get to the issue that Dragon Ball Z has, where it's just they keep having to up the ante because the main superhero is just too OP.
Well, but here's the thing. Dragon Ball Z, Dragon Ball Super, like, as much as I loved it growing up, even after educating myself on the nuances of writing, and it's not very well written.
it's fun, but it's not well written.
Yeah. Exactly. Dragon Ball Z, I can appreciate it for what it is. People beating the shit out of each other, and I loved it. Every second of it growing up, it's just like Trunks is powering up and about to kick Cell's ass. Hell yeah, let's do this. But like
Saga, here we go.
Exactly. But like, so as a combat like high, Dragon Ball Super is great, but writing wise, it's pretty bad.
Yeah. I think the thing about 14 is I don't think 14 has to face that issue for two reasons. One of which is, one, you can keep power levels very ambiguous, which means that, you know, for instance, we don't talking about soul density, right? Like what amount does that linearly translate to power? Right. It's not made explicit because of that. What something's relative power is can be ambiguous, which helps them. But more than that, you know, we don't have a scouter telling us, the power level's over 9,000. But more than that, because 14's story is rooted in character, I don't think you ever need a situation where you need to worry necessarily about an entity. Oh, we need to go bigger than Medion. We don't ever need to go bigger than Medion.
No.
All we have to do is create a threat to the world or the people we love or to peace or security, or like it can always be complicated. And while there needs to be interesting fights for the Warrior of Light, because from a gameplay standpoint, I think they've set themselves up for how they've been telling narratives not to have to deal with that problem as much as you might think.
Honestly, I entirely agree with that, because, and to reinforce that point, I always point back at, do you remember that cutscene back in Uldal where that woman was being attacked and she essentially is on the ground reaching out, begging for you to help her?
Yep.
That scene is just one person on the ground begging for you to save them. It's not a country that's about to go up in flames. It's not the world that's about to fall into pieces. Just a single person asking for help, and you're able to give it to them. That is the hero's like journey. That's their reason for existing. So as long as you have simple moments like that, moments that ground you and keep you connected to the environment, it doesn't need to be a big galaxy-ending nonsense.
Totally. As long, yeah, it's if you root it in caring about people. And then the thing is, like, you could make an expansion that's about adventuring through the new world, and you don't need to make a trial that's Gobz. You just need to make trials that are interesting. Okay, you go to the new world, and one of the trials is someone manages to summon, I don't know, someone in the new world actually finds out about primal summoning again. And it's like, tempering's not an issue, but we have to face like a primal that's really strong, but isn't actually necessarily a huge threat or something.
There's still an aether consumption problem.
Right. You know, there's plenty of established threats that are threats not just because of their scale.
Mm-hmm. It's funny you bring that up, Elio, because every time in this expansion when an NPC has looked at the Warrior of Light saying like, oh, well, you still haven't explored this yet, have you? Every time they say that, I look at the screen, I'm like, don't you dare patronize me. I've been wanting to learn more about this place for years.
Yep. No, and so, like, look, we just from a geographic standpoint of the three great continents, let's say, right? We haven't been to places like the Aras. We have not been to most of Ilsabord, like Corvos, Nalmask, Landis. We haven't been to Airslaint. We haven't been to the Unpromised. We haven't been to, like, there are so many places on 3 great continents we haven't been, and Mericidia is almost the size of the 3 great continents. The New World is bigger than them. Plus, we have, 2 minutes, it's like 4 reflections left that we can potentially visit. So, like, you know, there's tons of stuff. And that's why I love the ending of 6.0, because 6.0's, with Emmett's line, is trying to tell you that, like, if you think this world can only reduce in scope or can only expand through threats, there's still so much adventure left to be had just in and of itself.
Exactly. That there's so much to explore. So whenever I see someone say like, "Oh, I can't wait to go to another shard," I'm like, "But we haven't even seen what's next door yet."
Yes. I think for me, I'm getting a little tired of the whole trope of saving the world, saving the universe. I kind of just want to have something a little bit more simple, local, down to earth. Because I don't know.
Can I interest you in Island Sanctuary?
Oh, I love.
It's like I feel like there always has to be a problem that needs to be solved. There's always has to be a problem that needs to be solved. So
Yeah.
True. I mean, Shiloh's right. The conflict is the cornerstone of change, but that conflict doesn't need to be the world's about to break.
I mean, conflict can be what is the right way forward. Like, Garly and Eorzean were working together, but what is the right way forward for Garlemald, right? And that's why I don't want to say get annoyed. I feel like that's more mean than I mean it. But I get annoyed when people dismiss things like the Garlean stories, or like the stories that are about creating a world with a broader and a more complex world, because that's where you can get a lot of really interesting... Conflict doesn't just mean two people standing in utter opposition. It can also mean what is not necessarily agreeing on the right way forward, but trying to find it. And I think you have to have sections like the Garlean section. You have to have stuff like that to have a world where you can do that doesn't feel like bullshit. Because if you're just doing that, if you're doing everything's 2D and then doing nuance, it doesn't work. You have to make it so that feels like there's that vibrancy all the way throughout.
Yeah, you know the kind of conflict that needs to be resolved so that players will stop leaving like really weird comments in my videos.
Yeah.
Just get some sort of reconciliation between like the players and the elementals of Gridania. Because for some reason
it's always Gridanian role players.
For some reason there are so many players in Final Fantasy XIV that say like death to the elementals, burn Gridania to the ground, it's irredeemable. And I'm sitting here going,
misread this. It's funny. You must get those guys. I get those people for Ul'dah. So like I think what happens is some people learn certain levels of information about the world in 14, don't necessarily haven't dug deeper and make assumptions about what is true about that from a very absolutist lens. So for instance, the elementals being not great to live with in terms of you need to abide by their rules and finding balance with them, and therefore because of that, and they kick the Ixal out. Like, the elementals in a vacuum seem like assholes, but you have to remember they're coming off of the back of like the 5th Astral Era and the events of like Mach and Alec and the War of the Magi and like Man, and so they have their own perception that's about...
Oh my god, there was someone who blamed the elementals for the 6th Umbral Calamity because they didn't get between Amdapor and Mach.
They should have done something.
No, they said they blamed the elementals for sitting and watching.
They're nature spirits. They didn't even work with Amdapor. Amdapor wasn't even allowed into the Shroud. When Amdapor was formed, it wasn't really in the Shroud. They didn't have a relationship with the elementals.
The Black Shroud back then was just a tiny little forest full of spirits that didn't really know how to trust mortals, and they sure as hell learned not to trust people after that.
Dude, there's sentient climate control. What do you want?
What do you want from them?
But like, you can look at any of the 3 starting nations, Limsa, what it did to the kobolds, and to an extent the Sahagin, or Ul'dah and the way it's treated in the past 20 years, like the Amalja and stuff. Like, you can look, if you narrowly select for the worst moments of any shitty state, they all have terrible things they've done. But what the thing that 14 does is it's about story kind of about reconciling that. That's why patches like 5.4 exists. Right? You don't just go to 5.5 and all of a sudden, well, all the tribal groups are with us now. You have patches like 5.4, which is predominantly, yes, about testing like a tempering, like freeing from tempering, but is about that relationship between kobolds and Limsa and like really contending with it. And then you also have like earlier on, you're contending with that with 2.2 with Leviathan and Y'shtola and her comments to Merlip. So Merlip is sitting on that. It's like a plot point that's going throughout. Onto even the role quest when you're doing basically that same thing but with the Sahagin.
Speaking of Merlweb, people don't seem to understand exactly how many bodies she's piled up.
Merlip's done some shit. Like, not just even matchup, but I mean
stuff. Like, she has
killed away to the New World.
So many people And yet the MSQ never conveniently forgets how bloody her hands are.
Okay, I will defend that I do think in the MSQ it does, but only if you're looking at Enzar, because Enzar just seems to be the only one who remembers how much she's done, and then you have people like Sicard like, I'm gonna challenge her, and like, literally, Enzar looks at her, and Sicard thinks that Enzar's face of fear is for Merlin, and no, he's literally, you can tell he's looking at Merlin, he's like, don't kill this dude, don't kill this boy. I know you don't want my boy. But like, yeah, it does feel like Enzar's the one person who like kind of actually conveys, if you're paying attention to the amount of shit.
Oh no, yeah, even after the duel, if you talk to Merlin, she's like, I'm glad he stepped in, it would have been a shame to murder him.
Yeah.
I'm like, damn, Merlin.
I mean, what more do you need to know than that Mistbeard chose to serve under her than to continue his plight?
The Pirate King gave up. That would be like if Luffy from One Piece is just like, nope, this bitch knows what's going on.
Yeah, literally, 100%. That's a perfect way to put it.
Yeah.
Like, so it's just, I think it's very, very important to, whenever you learn information in this game, not just about like checking where it's coming from, but like that's important too, and paying attention to that, but also never taking an absolutist tone, because multiple people can have perspectives. For instance, like how people describe like the Cockern or goblins or something is very relative. But also like to not make sure that there's like not more nuance or context going on. You know, I mean, a good example is, I think one of the better examples is the way in which people are like, oh, there's no Duskwhite lore in the game. I'm like, Gelmora exists.
It's still there. They still live there.
Yeah. And then also we like, so it's one of those things where it is important to like keep that in mind rather than just assuming the game has completely failed on something.
No, yeah. Well, it is a shame because honestly, like I do wish that at some point they address that. Gelmora has always been there, and there are people still living their lives there.
I say Criterion Dungeon. We're gonna get like in the North Shroud, you know,
please. I would be totally on board for that, man.
Because then I say we get that, and then we get like an Ogamoro, like when they go to north part of Vilbrand, because then you'd have one for each starting city. I feel like that would be a good way to explore that stuff.
Yeah. What's the reward for this Criterion Dungeon? Because I know we got a mount last one, right?
I don't think we know the reward.
There's the Lantern mount is definitely from Mount Rokon, because the like evil yokai mount, because that's a yokai, and Rokon is definitely in Hingashi, like you can tell from the architecture. And then also I think literally I think I remember watching the live letter, the enemy names were like Hingen blah 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 when I went. So
we're gonna get a lot lore from that thing. I'm so excited.
Dude, but here's my question, Scribe. Why do you? So I'm assuming we're getting into Shishu because Hancock is like, actually, there's something going on in Mount Rokon, and they've heard of you, and could you come help them deal with that? But do you think like stepping into Shishu is a way that we at some point could step into like Koshu, like the main island of Hingashi at some point, and like go to like Bugyo or something?
Honestly, I don't know, because I have just as many ways to say no as yes.
Totally.
It's always weird because, like, on one hand, it's just like, no, they've established that they want to keep that, like, off limits. And I'm like, okay, sure. You want to be isolationist Aero Japan? Sure. But on the other hand, I'm like, that would be curious to go there.
I mean, they set up to an extent. Razat Han is kind of isolationist for a long time, and, you know, that changed.
Honestly, that was a 10-year payoff.
Yeah. With it being Edo Japan, it'll be interesting to see like how that, or like, well, kind of like late Edo, early Meiji, but it'll be interesting because if we do that, then I would have hope for doing something like going to Volnane over in like Dalmasca Inferior at some point. But we'll see if that ever happens because of how it's tied up in the Matsuno stuff.
Okay, I think with that, I think it's time to end our little show.
Sorry for rambling.
No.
Oh no, it's fine. It's entertaining. It's just like, no. The thing about it is, I was just listening, right, and I look at the time, and it's just like, whoa, you've been talking for that long? Because it's just like beginning though, it's just like, it's interesting.
Next time I don't know when I can go going for another 2 hours.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, Scott. I like you want to like. I learned this for a reason. Let's put it to use.
Right.
Oh man.
Elio, Scribe. Thank you for coming on the show, and just I guess we'll start with Elio. What do you got going on? What do you got going on in the future? What do you want to plug with your channel?
I've been right now taking a little bit of time off from like video creation, mainly for mental health stuff. But I still stream. But so like that should be coming back. And then I've just got oodles of scripts I just got to produce at some point. Mainly though, right now main things I do is Monday and Tuesday I've been restreaming the MSQ. We're right now going through Endwalker again. And then be streaming replay of the old Final Fantasy games with Ninieri on Thursdays, and then on Saturdays. Right now, we've been doing a musical leitmotif stream. So what happens is we go through the music for each expansion, and we figure out where they pop up in ways that you don't expect. So a good example would be like Penitus, the theme for Castrum Meridianum, or the Praetorium, is the same theme as A Land Long Buried from The Burn. It's the exact same musical theme because at the end of it, you meet Gaius again. Or on Westerly Wind, the Lenosian like theme where you like traveling around like in the main maps is actually the same musical theme as Siren Song Sea Dungeon. It's just slowed down and made to sound eerie. It's like cool stuff like that.
That's really cool. Yeah. What about you, Scribe? What do you got going on in your life?
I mean, same as always. New lore content every week. Like a new lore video or two. I'm finishing up the Elizin video. Rework with that has its own little short story attached and everything. Other than that, I'm just about done editing the writing of Riddles of Aether episode 1. So that's going to be fun. I'm going to try and get some voice talent in on that one. But other than that, just my usual shtick. More lore content every week.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys both for coming on. Thank you to the 5 people on Twitch that we have on stream and the 4 people on TikTok. And thank you for being here. If you want to, if you want to listen to the entire thing, I did have the ability to put the podcast on Spotify, on Apple Music, on Google Podcast, on iHeartRadio, which apparently is still a thing. So you can find us anywhere that you listen to podcasts. And next week we have a spoiler cast all about the raid, the Pandemonium raid story. So that's going to be fun. We have Stout Helm coming on, and two other guests that I'm going to keep secret for now. But again, thank you all for showing up, and everybody in chat, just have a great day.
Bye.
Bye. All right, we are done.